Welcome, everyone, to another week of the FLIRT series. That's Friday Light Informal Research Talks. My name is Garrett Richards, and along with Daniel Nadolny and Jennifer Buxton, we are the committee for the FLIRT series. Basically, what we try to do with this series of talks is take research going on at Grenfell campus or involving Grenfell campus researchers and community partners and ask someone to make a talk that makes that information accessible and interesting to a more general audience or to other disciplines. And we are supported by the Office of Research here at Grenfell and the Office of Engagement. And if anybody is interested in getting an update each week on what we have going on, you can join our mailing list. You can just pop your email on the comment section there on Facebook or here in WebEx if you're joining us directly into the channel. And we'll make sure to give you an update. And yeah, other than that, I think that's all the introductory material I want to give. So today we have Ivan Savic, who is an instructor with the Environment and Sustainability Program at Grenfell, and he'll be giving a talk about Brexit. So I will turn it over to him. Welcome, Ivan.
Okay, so basically, this is a follow-up on a talk I gave last year. And last year, Britain formally left the European Union. This was the transition period. It's kind of an interesting trick to try to do a transition while you're also dealing with a global pandemic. But Boris, ever the overachiever, felt that he could do both. And it's actually interesting. I actually kept this set of pictures, this caricature that was done last year, and it was basically a response to the government issuing a 50 pence coin, which said peace, prosperity, and friendship with all nations, which was sort of the commemorating Brexit and Britain leaving the EU. The response, and actually like this one in particular, Britannia shooting herself in the foot. We have Boris Johnson as both the Queen and the Unicorn, and the fear that basically what the British government was counting on, because there's this idea that they were going to not only negotiate a trade agreement with the EU, but they were also going to start negotiating other agreements, and there's a lot of hope for an agreement with the United States, although this came with concerns by a number of people that this might mean the US being able to start competing and even taking over parts of the NHS. Now, after a year, only about the first character is still relevant. Britannia seems to be still shooting herself in the foot. Boris Johnson has actually lost quite a bit of power and influence from the sort of electoral victory he had back in December of 2019. And with the Biden administration, not only is the nature of the trade agreement that Britain could have with the United States different, but there's even an indication that it might not happen anytime soon because this isn't a priority for the Biden administration. And the focus is more on, getting out of the economic crisis that's related to COVID. And the Biden administration has, for example, created a Buy America policy, and it is trying to balance that with pre-existing economic relationships. So there's already been some preliminary discussions between him and Trudeau about what this means for Canada. But this likely doesn't mean that any new free trade agreements are going to be signed with the UK, although that is still a possibility. So what I want to do today is talk a little bit about the transition so far. It's still very early days, but so far the signs haven't been, very good. I'm going to talk a little bit about the impact on the UK and the EU economies. And this would actually go over a lot of the things I talked about a year ago. But I just want to sort of update them. And, obviously, if you didn't listen to my talk, then, I'll go over everything again. But even if you did, there'll still be new information. I'll talk a little bit about the impact of COVID-19. I actually thought that it would actually act as cover for any damage that Brexit might cause, but it actually seems that this might not be the case. And uh, although uh, Johnson and his government have actually tried to basically use COVID-19 response as a way of deflecting issues surrounding the transition, uh, this might not be a very successful strategy. And then finally, I want to talk about the political implications. And I think that's going to be sort of the core of my talk here. So, first of all, how's the transition gone so far? Well, uh, there's been success in the sense of there haven't been major disasters, but even this success is kind of qualified. First of all, and especially at the beginning of January, a lot of Brexiters were saying all the Ramoners and all the Project Fear people said that there's going to be chaos at the border, but none of that is happening, right? So they're wrong. Well, they're changing their tune now. First of all, there hasn't been much problems so far, partially because a lot of business enterprises have actually stockpiled things in case there was any kind of transition. And this is just a logical response. Even if the transition was better organized, problems would be inevitable, delays would be inevitable. So industry sort of prepared for this, but it ended up being much worse than. But the delays have already been bad despite this, and there's some issues right now about how long trucks actually have to wait at the border and the problem that this can actually have, and so on. We can go into a little more detail. Another thing is that a lot of Brexiters were crowing about the fact that the Nissan Sutherland plant, which is a big industrial enterprise in Sutherland, and which is very important because this is an economically depressed region. And the Nissan has basically said we're staying, and it's going to be business as usual. Now there are a couple of things about this. First of all, Nissan, like a lot of corporations, they don't like to make political waves unless they feel something is a core interest is being threatened. And even that aside, the fact that Nissan is staying is not as rosy as it first seems. First of all, this is partially a result of the government investing about 80 million pounds in the plant. And this isn't to increase capacity. This is just basically to help with the transition and make sure that Nissan doesn't leave. And secondly, Nissan has already discussed the possibility of some layoffs. These are relatively limited, about 100 or so people, but in an economically depressed region, this could actually still be significant. Now, these are still relatively small things, but part of the problem is that even if these were unmitigated successes, they're not the kind of they're not really large scale successes, right? Now, of course, you could say this is still early days, and that's fair. But so far, the transition hasn't really produced much benefit. However, it has actually produced a number of pains. This was obvious, but the government decided to downplay these possibilities, which actually might lead to a number of problems. So there have been shortages, nothing too serious so far, but these things might get worse, right? And it might be, and there's a question about how long this transition could happen. We've also seen delays in the provision of goods and services. But most importantly, we've actually seen things like the fishing industry has been hit pretty hard. And of course, this is a problem because defending UK the fishing industry was one of the key things that Brexit was sold on. But the fishing industry is finding that their quotas haven't increased. In some cases, they've gone lower. They've also found that it's actually harder to sell their fish. And some some economic concerns have basically found that they're having less business rather than more. One example, so there's been protests by people cultivating shellfish. Those who sell, I think they're called glass eels, sell them mainly across the European Union, found that they haven't gained new markets, but it looks like that at least in the short term, they're losing markets because a lot of European buyers are actually shifting to local production because less paperwork, less costs, and so on. The financial industry is also in a bit of a turmoil. The government didn't do enough to basically ensure access to the European market. And Britain is one of the largest, well, the City of London is, I actually believe it even recently, a couple of years ago, overtook New York as the sort of financial, as a financial hub. However, a lot of that was because it provided international access to the EU. Now, this is something that's going to be lost. And there's a question about how much, this is actually causing some pain to the financial industry. And the Europeans have indicated that, we're going to work with the financial industry, but they're now third parties, right? So we're going to favor our own financial centers. Probably the worst outcome is that the ministry in charge of courting foreign investment into the UK has actually recommended that British firms temporarily relocate outside of Britain, and particularly in the European Union, in order to minimize disruptions, right? So even if this is a temporary measure, which the government hopes it is, it's not a good sign. And it actually, in essence, it basically speaks to the fact that the trade negotiation was not fought out as well as it could have been. And now there's sort of these economic pains that are worse than they should have been, right? Now, the question is, what does this mean for the long term? It's hard to say. And of course, this doesn't mean that, this is Britain's future from now until forever, right? But we are looking at long-term issues, right? So even before the referendum, so this is basically the UK growth compared to other G7 countries, and starting in the 2012, after the recovery from the financial crisis, it was sort of a leader here, and then after the referendum, it sort of shifted to one of the lowest, right? And this trend hasn't really changed much. And of course, the economic impact of the coronavirus has, hit the British economy hard, as it has a lot of other economies, right? And this is just another graph basically showing the same thing, that basically growth has now declined relative to what it was before the referendum, right? Now, in terms of trade treaties, and this is important because Brexit was sold on the idea that global Britain would be able to compete and increase its trade once it leaves the European Union. And of course, so far this hasn't materialized. The UK did sign a treaty with Japan in October of 2020, and they were actually advertising this, and it actually is a good achievement. However, it doesn't provide the same access to the Japanese market that the EU has in the treaty that they signed prior to this, right? So even though it's a very good step, it actually means a reduction in potential trade rather than an expansion, right? So it's a stopgap to cover what hasn't been covered before. Sorry, I thought I had another slide for that next. I think it's a little later on. The second thing is, and this was very important, the UK was able to sign a trade treaty with the EU, but it has led to a reduction of access, right? So in fact, as one economist pointed out, this is the first time in the post-war period where two countries have actually negotiated a trade treaty which will reduce the amount of free trade rather than increase it, right? So the trade treaty itself is an important step, and leaving the EU without a trade agreement would have been an absolute disaster. But this was sort of this was going to be a hit either way because of loss of access. The loss of access was going to be compensated through freer trade agreements, but this, of course, hasn't materialized. And the question is how quickly it will. There was a lot of the Johnson government was hoping for a trade treaty with the United States. There was a number of problems with this potentially because even though Trump was an ally of Johnson and was very pro-Brexit, probably the most pro-Brexit politician outside of the UK, he also isn't really sort of known as being very warm and fuzzy, and any access to the U.S. market would actually mean removing a number of barriers from England, which would mean changing food standards, changing the British government would have to change things like the NHS and so on. Now that the Biden administration is left, probably means that an agreement would probably be less, for lack of a better word, predatory on the sides of the United States, but it also probably means that it's going to be delayed. Right now, Biden's priority is A, getting the pandemic under control, and B, getting the economy on track. And the focus has been more internal rather than external, right? So any administration in the future, whether it's still Biden or whenever it comes up, will actually try to negotiate a trade agreement with the UK, but there's no telling when this is going to happen. And a similar problem exists with the rest of the world, right? So Britain's short-term future is not that rosy, especially given the financial crisis. And usually economic downturns are periods when trade barriers go up rather than down. So negotiating new trade treaties will be difficult. Even if things stay the way they are and no new trade barriers are created, this might not be a situation where new trade agreements are going to be formed, right? So what's the long-term impact of this going to be, right? Well, just to put this in context, the US exports a similar amount to the EU and non-EU countries. In fact, it exports a lot to non-EU countries. However, the EU is still the largest single bloc. In 2014, it basically represented 44% of UK trade. Again, the hope was that the United States would be a big area of trade, but this hasn't materialized so far. And from the European Union point of view, Britain is a very large slice. It's about 16%, but you can basically see that the EU is a much more important trading partner for the UK than the UK is for the EU. And this is illustrated here too, is that if you look at EU trade overall, including basically EU trade with the rest of the world and EU trade within the bloc itself, British trade only represents about 8%. Now, of course, during a recession, losing 8% of your economic activity or limiting in it is going to be bad. But the impact on the UK is going to be much worse, right? Just simply in relative terms. The additional problem is even though there's this hope for the global Britain being able to make new trading agreements, it's actually missing out because this is a map of all the free trade agreements that that the European Union has already signed or is basically waiting for ratification. And you can see that the EU also has a free trade agreement with Japan, right? So in essence, Britain has managed to sort of maintain, hasn't lost out on this agreement, but it's not as good as the one that the EU has. In addition to this, there are a number of trade agreements that are being negotiated, which basically Britain needs to negotiate their own, right? So it's actually missing out a lot of agreement. And of course, one of the problems is that the negotiation with the European Union has shown that Britain doesn't have the capacity for trade negotiations that the EU has, right? Simply put, the UK basically transferred this to the EU, and the EU has these expertise which Britain is sort of slowly developing, right? So, in essence, in the long term, Britain will be able to recover, but it's going to take longer than a lot of Brexiters assume, right? There's also still this question about what kind of relationship the EU is going to have with the UK, and the problem is that Brexiters kept on changing the goalposts. They talked about having a relationship like Switzerland or like Norway, but we actually see that both of those groups have much more integration than Brexiters actually want, right? So this idea that they'll be able to maintain the economic access to the single market while having freedom is not correct, right? And right now we're kind of at the sort of we have the UK has a deal that's better and has more access than Canada does, but also Canada isn't as integrated in the European Union as Britain was, right? So what are the economic consequences going to be, right? So first of all, there's going to be costs to Brexit, and some of them are already materializing. The new trade deals aren't materializing yet. I've already talked about how free trade with the United States and the new Biden government isn't guaranteed, and it's not going to happen soon. But the truth is, this wasn't going to happen even if Trump was reelected. I think that the hopes of Brexiters of Trump being a white knight that helps them were kind of misplaced, right? And this actually will lead to questions of what kind of economic policy that the UK is going to follow, right? Now, is the UK going to continue, or basically, are the Conservatives going to continue in the kind of austerity policies that they've actually been engaged since they were in power in 2000, well, around the start of the financial crisis? Or are they going to go into social investment? So far, it seems that with some sort of localization, like investing in the north, and I'll talk about why that's significant in a moment, that they seem to be following the same kind of austerity route. And this is going to be a big problem because the problems with leaving the European Union are going to be exacerbated by the economic fallout of the pandemic, right? So it's actually two economic hits at the same time. And if the Conservatives respond with the same kind of austerity measures that they've had in the past, which incidentally were also one of the reasons why people voted for sorry, I guess I'm hungry, voted for Brexit, is because the Conservatives were good at convincing them that the austerity was not a result of their policies, but of costs imposed by the European Union. And if they left the European Union, they'd have all this money to invest in their own economy. That isn't the case. And what's more important, the Conservatives don't really want to do that, right? So the economic outlook for the UK in the short term is not very good. Now, of course, this doesn't mean that the UK economy is going to shrink and disappear into irrelevance, but that the growing pains are going to be last for quite a bit. What about the EU? Well, we're going to have shrinking budgets and basically lower spending, increasing contributions. We are going to have some economic contraction, but this is going to be also tied in with COVID responses, right? And as I'll talk about in a moment, from the EU perspective, this will be relatively small compared to the overall problems with the pandemic, whereas Brexit will be seen as, worsening the situation in the EU. This is basically just Brexit is something that was done to them rather than a decision by the government, which is actually going to make the economic impact of Brexit bigger in the view of people in Britain than it is in the European Union. And overall, it was going to have less of an impact relative to the overall economy in the EU compared to the impact it'll have in Britain. So, what about the impact of the pandemic? Well, the situation in Britain is kind of mixed. They've recently reached 100,000 deaths. And currently, even though they don't have the highest death rate, they have the current highest, well, not the overall highest death rate, but the rate of death in the last couple of weeks has been higher than any other country, right? Which is a problem. They've had successes with vaccinating their population. There is some tension between, so there's a bit of a row now because there's a glitch in producing vaccines in Belgium, and the EU wants to basically fix this by taking vaccines that are meant for Britain, whereas Britain is saying we need to get access to this. The company is still, it's still sort of an open issue. But in terms of the economic problems, this is going to be a more serious issue for the UK economy, as I explained. And the part of the problem is it's going to interact with Brexit, because you're going to have a shrinking of the economy in the short term, coupled with the loss of long-term safety cushions, right? Now, originally I had thought that the sort of pain of Brexit was going to be covered by the economic impact of the pandemic, and that the kind of support that the Conservatives have been getting in some circles with their pandemic response was going to help them weather the storm. However, the problem is that Brexit is hitting particular industries very clearly, and it's harder to hide these impacts, right? And so rather than COVID, the economic problems associated with COVID-19 covering up for Brexit, they're going to actually, there's going to be exposed, and it's going to be seen as this is an additional mistake we did in addition. And of course, this is also an unforced error, because Johnson had the possibility of postponing the transition period due to the pandemic. And he said that, no, there was no need for that. So now, of course, this isn't going to be an issue for a lot of hardcore Brexiters, but those who are more skeptical about Brexit, or those who oppose it, they're going to see this as a significant problem. So where does this leave, Britain? Well, this time last year, Boris Johnson was sort of high on his electoral win, right? It was described as a landslide, and he managed to flip a number of districts that, especially in the north of England, which were traditionally Labour strongholds. And in addition to this, Labour also lost a lot of ground in Scotland. Well, the Conservatives and Labour both lost ground in Scotland to the SNP, which is the Scottish Nationalist Party. And so basically that's one of the problems, that basically Scots have turned to nationalism and have abandoned sort of the other parties. And the other problem is that this landslide isn't as large as it might seem. So basically, in terms of seats, it's a very dramatic shift. However, in terms of percentages, the Conservatives were only able to increase their vote by about 1%. And Labour lost a lot of ground, but most of that went to support the Scottish National Party, and the Liberal Democrats, right? The other problem is that the process for ratification it was actually a difficult process, basically getting the agreement through the European with the European Union through Parliament, and it was basically agreed to almost in the last minute. But another problem is that all three devolved assemblies, so basically the Parliament, they're not all technically called parliaments, but I'll stick with that term. The parliaments in Scotland, Northern Ireland, and Wales all rejected the Brexit agreement, right, which indicates a number of problems with it. I'll skip this. And I think there's two important fault lines in politics now. First of all, there's been increased calls for Scottish independence, and there's a lot of worry about, especially in the DUP, which is the Democratic Union Party, the primary party in Northern Ireland, who is for who's against Irish unification and for the union with England. But they're very worried now, even though they're trying to downplay this, but they're very worried about the prospect of Irish unification as a result of this. So how could this happen? Well, in the case of Scottish independence, the costs of Brexit are very clear, and the Scottish clearly voted against Brexit, right? So they kind of feel a bit betrayed. And there's an additional element of this because during the Scottish independence referendum of 2014, the no vote won out because there was this promise of, if you leave, you're not only leaving Britain, but you're also leaving the European Union, and we're going to stay in the European Union. So in essence, this is a promise that a lot of Scots feel sort of betrayed on this point. The SNP has actually been very strong, and there's going to be another Scottish election for the local parliament. And right now, the SNP looks like it's on track to actually win back a majority and actually gain additional seats. If that happens, they've promised that they're going to hold another referendum. There are some constitutional obstacles to this, and there might even be EU opposition for Scotland joining, specifically from Spain, because Spain worries that this could be a precedent that the Catalans could use and so on. But it looks very clear that Scotland could be headed for an independence referendum, and while it's not guaranteed they did win, chances are good, and I think chances are better than they were in 2014, right? Given what's changed, and especially if Brexit doesn't get fixed in the next, the teething pains don't get fixed in the next year or two, this gives more reason to basically think about independence. From the point of the Irish question, there's a lot of debate about what to do with the border and border checks, and what's really it's come down to is that the UK has actually retreated from the Irish border and in essence has set up a border check basically in the Irish Sea, right? So this has in effect become a process of economic unification. The other thing too is that any dispute that comes out of this sort of agreement, the EU has said clearly that it's going to support Ireland, right? And so this gives the UK a disadvantage. And there's an additional disadvantage because in the US, there's a lot of political support for Ireland, right? Despite the special relationship with the UK, in kind of any dispute, it's very likely that political pressure would actually support Ireland. So there is a possibility of gradual or not so gradual economic unification. And the question is, will this actually stay with political separation? I'm going to skip this and just go to what the outcome is. So is the United Kingdom going to stay united? All things considered, this is a strong possibility, but it's not as clear as I think a lot of people would want. And Boris Johnson and the DUP have actually been trying various ways to undermine this. So Boris Johnson went to Scotland recently. This has been criticized for, you know, just spreading and not really being anything other than optics. He's dismissed the possibility of another referendum, saying there's no basis for it. Nobody in Scotland wants it. It's already been settled. But these arguments don't really hold water. It's sort of the same thing with the DUP saying, oh, well, there's not going to be reunification and so on. But deep down, they're worried. So is dissolution of the United Kingdom possible? It is, but it's hard to, it's dramatic action on this front might not be clear. I actually think that there's a possibility of kind of an in-between measure. And this is highlighted by agreements that have been created prior and actually as a result of Brexit. So as a result of Brexit, Gibraltar, which was a British territory that borders Spain, and there was a lot of concern about what was going to happen to Gibraltar. But basically, what the EU and UK negotiated was that um, economic integration would remain at levels they are right now. And if anything, it gives Spanish EU citizens more access to the Gibraltar economy than it does Brits to the Spanish economy. Similarly, Greenland, which is a territory of Denmark, left the European Union a number of years ago. So they're still politically united with Denmark, but are outside the European Union. This, I think, is significant because it brings both of these examples bring the possibility of economic and regulatory integration between Scotland, the European Union, and Northern Ireland and the European Union, and the United Kingdom being left out. Or they're basically, the sort of the idea of little England, right? I do think that there's a very strong possibility of successful Scottish independence referendum. I think that in the case of Northern Ireland, it's more likely to be a gradual process of economic integration, which eventually might lead to a political union or some kind of condominium. But it's sort of still early to tell. So I went a little longer than I hoped, but that's everything, and we can go over questions now.
Thanks, Yvonne. Very interesting, as always, and I appreciated the approach that you took where you summarized some of the earlier stuff that you would have said in past talks, because as you're right, I don't remember all of that stuff. And there's all sorts of bits and pieces when it comes to this transition. So I think it's helpful for understanding the complexity. So I'll encourage folks to put questions in the chat box there for WebEx if you're joining us directly. If you're viewing on Facebook, you can put questions as comments under the live stream. While we wait for that, I'll ask some questions.
I have a question.
Oh, go ahead, Jen.
Okay. I can't remember if you covered this or not, but because I had to step away for a second. But did you talk about the Ireland border and how did that end up getting solved? I know that was a huge issue.
Yeah. So basically, it ended up being solved by, in essence, just ignoring the border. So, in essence, what's happened is that economically, the sort of they've been integrated, and actually that's caused problems because for England, because there's actually a row that happened in Parliament, or a Conservative politician was complaining about why are potato chips that are going to Northern Ireland being processed at the customs in Britain when they're not going to the EU, and the simple reason is they don't know, because there are no border checks in Ireland, and that sort of technology that the Johnson government said was going to be around to fix these problems hasn't materialized. And so, in essence, this has actually increased the bureaucracy. And that's actually an interesting point, that one of the justifications for Brexit was you're going to get rid of all this paperwork and bureaucracy, but the bureaucracy has actually increased, barriers have increased. And the worst part is that the British government isn't really prepared for all the bureaucracy it needs to impose. It hasn't hired enough people. The process is pretty complicated, so it's actually causing a number of barriers. And if this sort of continues, it might make more sense for Northern Ireland to slowly shift its economic activity from the UK to Ireland and the EU. And it's actually interesting that uh, Ireland itself has actually started to invest in more ferries between it and the European Union, right? So it's actually one of the things that Brexiters were saying, oh, once Britain leaves, Ireland will leave too. But actually, Ireland is slowly integrating more into the European Union as a result of Brexit.
Okay, I'll ask some questions too. So my first is kind of the basic question, but it's leading into another question. So the first one is, I guess, thinking a little bit more about the medium to long term. What would it look like, or would it be possible at some point for the UK to rejoin the European Union?
That's actually a hope of a lot of Remainers. That basically that after a few years of economic problems, and this actually could last for a decade. And the reason why it could last so long is because um, Britain doesn't have a lot of alternatives, and the economic crisis that's tied to the pandemic, which is actually in some ways worse than the crisis that happened in 2008, the global crisis. Um, is going to cause a number of problems, and Britain doesn't have. It's trying to create new economic ties as it's doing this, and so the biggest kind of the acid test for whether Brexit was going to be a success and be followed by others, or whether it was going to be a disaster, was in the long run whose economy is going to do better, right? And if Britain is doing poorly, but Germany and France are recovering faster, that actually could be an argument for leaving. And so I think there is a possibility, but it really depends on. There's going to be a lot of economic opposition. A lot of political opposition to this too. So a lot of Remainers feel that it's inevitable, especially since most young people are pro EU.
Well, and presumably the EU itself would have to consent to the UK rejoining.
Yeah,
So,
and actually that's one of the ironies is that the end result of this would be that the UK would lose a lot of its clout and influence in the European Union because the European Union is going to go on and they're going to make some changes. And Britain was able to block a lot of those changes because the story is bureaucratic EU is pushing poor little Britain around. But the fact is that Britain was one of the key voices in the European Union. It actually had a lot of clout and a lot of things had to change when they said they would change. But them being outside and then coming back in, they're going to find that things have changed a lot. They're still going to be an influential member, but their status is going to be diminished.
so my broader thought, building off of that, is besides maybe the potential for the UK to rejoin the EU at some point, what are some of the other implications if there were to be sort of a collective realization that this was a mistake? If you get enough of the people who voted to leave, people who are sort of on the fence but voted to leave, sort of saying, no, no, this was a mistake. I shouldn't have voted that way. And you kind of get this, I don't know, collective social awareness. What are some of the other implications besides that? Does it have broader implications for the way politics is conducted in the UK or anything else? When I see that Daniel has his hand up, I didn't notice that before, but after this, I'm going to go to Daniel.
Well, yeah, I can actually answer that pretty quickly. And there's a number of possibilities, but it's hard to say what will come out. It's still very possible that even if Britain rejoins, that Scotland and Northern Ireland still leave, which could weaken the political union. Another possibility is that this could really hurt the Conservatives. They had a bit of a resurgence, and like I said, they actually encroached on Labour territory. And some people are still happy, but the longer it goes, the more likely that they might lose some of these positions, and you could have the possibility of somebody like the Liberal Democrats slowly encroaching and then even taking over, especially if there is a possibility of Brexit leaving, sorry, of rejoining. You're going to have a resurgence of UKIP or other. Nigel Farage has already formed his I think third party. He's very prolific in that sense, and so that actually could be another way that could undermine the Conservatives. So I think those are the most likely outcomes.
Interesting. Okay, Daniel, sorry, I don't know how long your hand has been up, but I didn't notice it before, so please go right ahead.
No problem. I actually had some similar questions too, so I'm glad that you got to speak first. I really enjoyed the presentation, Ivan. And so I was wondering then, along similar lines to Garrett, about UK potentially eventually rejoining, and you were saying if that could be 10 years from now if it happens. So with and then you were talking about Scotland might still remain separate, and Scotland and Ireland might separate, but the overall outlook long term for the EU is stronger because of this. So assuming that things really go badly for the UK, which it seems quite likely. So the EU as a union is actually pretty happy with the long term outcome for how this is looking.
I think so, because there was one of the predictions, and it actually seemed in 2016 like it was coming true, because there was a lot of right-wing nationalist parties took this as a way of, we need to redefine the European Union. And there's a lot of, having your cake and eating it too. We're going to leave the EU, but we're also going to stay in the EU. But that's actually fizzled out. And there's not that many, strong, other exit voices. The other thing, and I think this is another possibility, is that some of the more dramatic things, like I said, for example, the United Kingdom dissolving into England and Wales and Scotland and Ireland unifying, and that something that dramatic might not happen, but it's also very possible that, and also Britain might not, or England might not return completely, but they might shift to something more like Switzerland or Norway. And so what that would mean is that there'd be, even if Britain, maybe out of principle, or, to say face decides we're not actually going to join, I think that in the long term, they actually might start signing up for things and adopting a number of policies like Switzerland does, like Norway does, and what might happen in Scotland and Northern Ireland might go back to their pre-Brexit position, fully integrated. England might be sort of in and out, not fully reintegrated, but not as untethered to the EU as it is right now. And the political union might stay, but it might slowly drift apart. So I think that kind of muddle along is, if I was going to put my money on something, it'd probably be on that. But more dramatic possibilities are also, possible. You could basically, in 10 or 20 years' time, the European Union might have, a united Ireland and 2 new members, England and Scotland.
Right. I have a question about younger people too, but I think Jennifer has her hand up.
Well,
you can ask your question first, Daniel, because my question is coming completely separate than the line of questioning you're doing. So go for it.
Okay. So I'll just maybe keep this one quick. But I know some people in the UK who were younger who were concerned about like they used to have all of Europe kind of available for their future and education and all these things. I was wondering if you know of what's going on with younger people. Like, have they been leaving the country if they can, and getting citizenship if they like remaining in the EU themselves, and kind of a brain drain type of thing, or is it hard to say what's happening?
Well, it's interesting because the very youngest have actually lost some opportunities. So, for example, Boris Johnson promised that Britain would still be part of the Erasmus program, which is sort of an exchange program to study abroad and so on, and that's been revoked. But the interesting thing is, it's not just young people that are trying to maintain their ties. Anybody who can is still trying to maintain their ties. A lot of people in Northern Ireland are applying for Irish passports to stay in the
Huh,
European
I
Union.
see.
And actually, a lot of wealthy Brexiters have actually made sure that they have a foot in both camps. So Nigel Farage has applied for. He's married to a German, and he's applied
Mm,
for German citizenship for his children,
mhm,
and he might even have a German passport. Uh, what is it? Uh, uh, Rees Mogg. I forget his first name. Um, he himself has actually shifted some of his hedge funds into Ireland, and I think he's also accessing um, uh, EU citizenship in some way. So basically, anybody who can is actually going for some kind of dual citizenship, right?
huh,
And a lot of companies that said, unless Brexit happens, we're leaving, even after Brexit have left as well.
right.
So and this is part of the hypocrisy where everybody knows it's valuable to have access to the EU, but they also want their own little fiefdom, and they want to
Mm.
basically, as Rees-Mogg said, have happy English fish in happy English waters. The fact that nobody's catching them and they can't sell them might be why they're happy, but as long as they're British, right? So
Thank you. And thanks, Jen.
So my question kind of goes completely off and talks about the trade stuff, because you mentioned the trade stuff at the beginning with Japan and the
mhm.
trade agreement with the EU and how that's all different in Canada and the US and all those things. Now there is the Commonwealth group, right, that meets
Yeah.
regularly. Is that an avenue that the UK might look to for trade? Like I know it has a lot of developing and underdeveloped countries on there,
Yeah.
but that would access like Australia, New Zealand, and Canada for the UK.
Yeah. Well, here's a case where Britain kind of burned its bridges a long time ago. Is that the reason why it stayed out of the EU for so long is that first it had the Empire, and then it had the Commonwealth, and then slowly they found that this wasn't as economically advantageous. So they actually, under Thatcher, went to join the European Union, and as a result of this, they actually ended up diverting a lot of trade, and this actually ended up hurting
Oh.
Australia and New Zealand. There has been, and obviously there's good reason to get access to these markets, but these same countries might make a lot of demands in return. So a lot needs to be renegotiated.
Right.
And the other interesting thing is, if you actually look on YouTube, you have a lot of people, I forget what it's called, but there's this sort of pipe dream of having a federation between Canada, the United Kingdom, Australia, and New Zealand. And a lot of people are even talking about, oh, this is the next power and all that. But this is very much a fantasy. I mean, I'm sure that very few people knew that this was, in this conference or in Canada, know that this is a possibility or it's inevitable. More economic and political and security cooperation between Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and Britain is likely as a result, but it's not going to be, a kind of federation. Like from the Canadian perspective, for example, would we really bet on integrating with these countries when our strongest economic ties are with the United States, and that, especially the West is looking to getting access to the Pacific, right?
Right.
So these are possible, and they're going to develop, but they're not. I don't think they're going to be as large to compensate for what's being lost.
Okay. Nope. That's perfect. Thank you. I was just curious about
Yeah,
that.
I mean that's one of the things that a lot of Brexiters were saying. Like, we used to be an economic power, we'll be one again. Yeah, but you were a necessary intermediary. You also had the largest navy in the world. These things don't exist anymore. People, Africa and China and Europe don't need Britain to trade for them, and Britain doesn't have the resources to push these sort of trade networks. So, yeah, a lot of those are kind of pipe dreams. It's like Mongolia is saying, we just need to beef up our cavalry again, and we'll have a nice little empire again.
Yeah, exactly. Thanks.
No problem.
I don't see any other questions or comments on Facebook or here on WebEx. Also, I'll just note that, and I guess there's an opportunity for somebody to post one last question while I say this, but I don't see any coming. So maybe we'll call it there. Thanks again, Ivan, for being a frequent FLIRT presenter. Always really interesting stuff. As I often say, I'm a political scientist, but I don't often spend the time to understand the ins and outs of actual world politics a lot of the time. So I really appreciate that you're doing that and you're able to summarize it for the rest of us. So thanks very much. Yes, Daniel says the saga continues. Yeah. Brexit 5, Brexit 6 are coming, I'm sure.
Yeah, exactly. And I do appreciate you guys indulging me. And, you know, like a lot of academics, I love the sound of my own voice. So it's always
you can watch the recording over and over. Yeah, no, we're always glad to have you.
But yeah, I do have that as backup.
Okay, well, thanks so much, Ivan. Thanks everyone else for joining us. I don't think we have a FLIRT next week, but we do have one the week after. So please keep your eye out for advertisements and news on Facebook, and we'll see you again. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.